Welcome back. I am attorney Nicholas Hicks, and this is part two of divorce. And to begin with, as I always tell you, this is not intended to be legal advice. This is legal information. You should talk to an attorney licensed to practice in the state of New York to see how this information applies to your particular circumstances. Now, the last time that we left off, we talked about the grounds for divorce, and we talked about the 7 grounds, and we laid those out. You only need one ground to qualify for divorce, assuming that you have jurisdiction in this state. Now, with respect to property, it's a general rule. Property is accumulated by both husband and wife from the moment that you say I do until a divorce action commences or there's a legal separation. And it does not matter, with some exceptions, it does not matter who purchased the property, whose name the property is titled in, where the money came from. If it was acquired during the course of the marriage, generally, it is considered marital property, and it will be distributed between the spouses. New York says equitably or fairly. Now, there are some exceptions to the acquisition of property. So, for example, if a spouse owned that asset prior to the marriage, then in most cases that will remain that spouse's personal separate property. Or if someone died and left something to one of the spouses, that falls outside of that marital estate or the marital property rule. If someone gave a gift to one of the spouses other than the other spouse, someone other than the husband and the wife gave the other spouse a gift, that generally falls outside of the marital estate. But most items, assets, cars, houses, jewelry, clothes, stocks, bonds, you name it, if it's acquired during the marriage, it's considered marital property. Now, debt works the same way, which is to say that as you're watching this video, your spouse is out shopping and running up credit cards. Well, that's considered marital debt in most cases. And that debt will also be distributed equally between, or I should say equitably, between the spouses. Now, the courts do look at some factors. For example, typical situation, one spouse acquires student loans, significant student loans during the course of the marriage. They put themselves through school. They have the benefit of the degree. In most cases, court's not going to make the other spouse responsible for those student loans, unless perhaps that the other spouse is claiming some property interest in that degree or that license. Then perhaps the court might look at it and say, well, then you should be responsible for some of the debt associated with it. So again, it's on a case-by-case situation. There are no hard, fast rules about how the court's going to apply those rules. It just depends on the circumstances. And again, the standard is equitable or fairness. The court is going to mete out assets and liabilities on a case-by-case situation in a manner that they believe to be fair. Okay? Now, the other thing that is important to understand in this state, in New York State, is that courts do not punish bad spouses. In other words, a court's not going to say to one spouse, you can have everything because your spouse cheated on you or was abusive or whatever the bad behavior is that's alleged. Property is not distributed based on good and bad behavior, and that's important to know because a lot of people are under the assumption that they're going to have a windfall of assets because they had a bad spouse. And in New York, that simply isn't true. Maybe it should be true, but it isn't true. Marriage is looked at in large part at the time of divorce as an economic partnership. It's like having a business partner. And the courts look at assets and debt that way. Again, not based on good and bad behavior or the ground for divorce, simply what are the respective financial positions of the parties, what are the sources of those assets, what are the sources of the debt, and then the court makes a determination about how those items are distributed, unless the parties can come to an agreement themselves. Okay, now, there are other issues, of course, that come up during the course of a divorce. For example, health insurance, which is a big deal now because so many Americans are uninsured or underinsured, or rely on their spouse for coverage. So what happens when there is a divorce? Can the uninsured spouse remain insured during and or after the divorce? Well, certainly during the divorce and during the divorce action, courts in most instances will tell the spouse who is insured that you can't take your spouse off of your insurance during the course of the divorce because you're getting a divorce or because you're angry or whatever the circumstances might be. The court might require the spouse who does not have the insurance to perhaps contribute to out-of-pocket expenses or other costs associated with having family coverage, perhaps. But in most instances, they do not want things to change during the course of the divorce. Whatever the status quo is, they usually want that to remain. However, after the divorce, of course, insurance companies are not going to allow the ex-spouse to be covered as a family member because legally they're no longer a family member. However, in New York State, a spouse or an ex-spouse, an uninsured ex-spouse, is entitled to 18 months of COBRA, which means that the insured spouse, that his company or her company, or whoever their employer is, has to make insurance available to the uninsured ex-spouse at whatever premium it costs. And that is for a period of 18 months, after which that ex-spouse is on their own. And there's a lot more to this insurance piece, but generally speaking, that is the rule. Now, maintenance, or what people refer to as alimony, that's changed a little bit, and there's a new calculations now for maintenance, and I won't go into that. But maintenance, again, remember, a lot of people are under the impression that alimony or maintenance will get paid if I can prove that I had a bad spouse. Again, it's not based, it's not, the purpose of it isn't to punish. The purpose of maintenance is to ensure some equality between the spouses. And the idea being that when these spouses were together, they enjoyed a particular lifestyle. And to the extent possible, we want to try to ensure that they can sort of maintain something like that lifestyle if possible. But even more importantly, what we want to make sure is that neither spouse becomes what we refer to as a public charge, which is to say, we don't want the divorce to cause one spouse to have to get on social services, for example, because they were the non-money spouse. So what happens is, in a situation where you have, you know, a usually medium to long-term marriage, but it can happen in shorter marriages, but you look at the length of the marriage, you look at the respective incomes of the parties. So let's just say that in this example, the wife is making $100,000 a year, the husband was a stay-at-home dad, worked part-time, and was making $15,000 a year. And this was a 10-12 year marriage. Well, the court very well in that situation, it would require the wife to pay the husband a certain amount of money for a certain period of time in order to bring his income up to the wife's income. So of course hers will come down and his will come up, and we try to even them out for a certain period of time, with the understanding again that we don't want in this scenario the husband to have to get social services and the taxpayer have to burden that debt. We make the spouses sort of balance that out by creating this maintenance requirement. So again, just as a general principle, that's how maintenance works. Maintenance is not in every case. Again, it depends on the respective incomes of the parties and the length of the marriage as well. Perhaps there's other factors. Now, with respect to the divorce, we won't get into the child custody and visitation and portion of it and support, because we talked about that in other videos, and that other information applies also in the divorce situation where there's children. Thank you for joining me, and again, I'm attorney Nicholas Hicks. Welcome back, and join me next time when we begin to talk about some other areas, hopefully of interest. Take care.